Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Saucis. Yoga is a 6,000-year-old tradition that has reached global popularity in latest years. Though generally associated with India, dedicated spiritual masters have passed it from one generation to the next at different times in history and in different parts of the world. Jesus Christ, one of the most revered masters of all times, may have very strong yogic roots, and many find his teachings just another expression of the knowledge of yoga. This is the second part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing Dharmadas and Nirmala from Ananda, Sacramento. To speak about Jesus' yogic nature, I invited today Dharmadas and Nirmala. Dharmadas and Nirmala are the spiritual directors of Ananda, Sacramento, a yoga community and teaching center in the Rancho Cordova area of Sacramento. They bring the experience of nearly 40 years of meditation, yoga, spiritual living, and practice to their teaching in North America, Europe, Asia, and India. Both raised as Christians, they have studied, taught, and worked with the teachings of Jesus from a mystical and yogic standpoint. In addition, they are both musicians who find joy in sharing spiritual teachings and inspiration through music. The center in Sacramento is part of Ananda, a global movement founded in 1968 by Swami Kriyananda based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. And if you were to identify one particular teaching that is most applicable to our world today, what would you think of?
I think for me, I would think of selfless service. So much of the wealth of this world is with so few people, and it's not necessary. People don't need so much to live well, and we can lift up people, we can educate children, we can do good works. And so that's one aspect of the teaching of Christ.
And would make Jesus a karma yogi.
Yes,
definitely.
Yes. And also we need to make him a Raja yogi. We need to not only serve people and give and lift up the downtrodden, but we also need to meditate. We need to have inner communion with God, as Jesus did. I and my Father are one.
The teaching of Christ that is most needed, that is perhaps in a way the least obvious from the Bible, is the teaching of inner communion. And that's the part where we experience the reality of that outward ritual on an inward level. And that tradition hasn't been so obvious in Christianity. And that's something that Yogananda really wanted to bring and emphasize in the West, teaching people how to find that. And he said that Jesus did teach those things.
How does Christianity view yoga in general?
Doesn't seem to, really. It's
very skeptical of yoga.
Yeah, there are a few cases, I think, where some traditions are open to it.
What do you think is the reason for the difficulty that Christianity has sometimes to embrace yoga, or that even good Christians have a hard time thinking that they could go to yoga or that they could just practice it? Especially when we dive into the more spiritual and philosophical aspects, because the asanas anybody can do, it doesn't matter what you believe in, you can bend forward or backward. But the other aspects seem to be the ones.
I think there's a natural fear of being disloyal. Christians have given their hearts to Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through him. And there's a loyalty there, which of itself is good. I think the hinge of it is just that, again, if the blinders open up a little bit, one can see that there is yoga in Christianity, and Christianity is in yoga. That was, as Dharmadas alluded to earlier, that was Yogananda's mission, was to show original Christianity and original yoga and how they are the same.
Yes, but then, then that is open to interpretation, or that is open to someone's organization of the knowledge, which in a way is what happened with the Bible, because the Gospels that we know are included in the present version of the Bible were the Gospels that Constantine thought went with his idea of the Roman Empire, and that's why he put it. Then he left others out that had somehow recently been discovered, where Jesus is more clearly depicted as a yogi. So which Gospels do we believe in? How do we know we're interpreting things right?
By the way, we believe that the reincarnation aspects of the Bible were taken out also.
Of course,
that's
yes.
very inconvenient.
Of course.
You know, let's not have people reincarnating.
Yes.
So,
Never mind that some of it is still there. It's just that it takes a little bit of looking at it to see. You know, Jesus is referring to himself and John the Baptist as Elijah and his disciple Elisha. I mean, it's there. It's a little bit subtle. Mm-hmm. But going back to the question about yoga and the Christian point of view, it's as Nirmala was saying, it's a sense of loyalty, but it's also just a sense of unfamiliarity. You know, we're dealing with terminology that come from a different culture, from a different religion in some cases. I mean, I was reading recently about a court case. In America, these things always come up in a court case. So some school system wants
Someone
to teach...
sued somebody else.
Right, someone wants to teach yoga in the school. That's religion. Your government is promoting religion. So, you know, it goes to court, and the court has to decide, is it religion, is it not religion, da-da-da-da-da. Never mind that, you know, head to the knee doesn't necessarily imply religion. So we get into issues like that, and in the West, people get very anxious about all that kind of stuff. And I have to say, it was a breath of fresh air to be in India, because there's just an automatic assumption that each separate person on the planet is going to have his own point of view, and that's just fine. There doesn't have to be, and this goes to the question you were just asking, there doesn't have to be one perfect interpretation of this quotation, the Bible, whatever it might be. People come to know. Jesus says, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Well, what is that truth? That truth is God. That truth is the actual reality of our own nature. But we have to do a little bit of work to get to it. We get up in the morning and we look in the mirror and we think, well, that's who I am.
Yeah.
Well, in 100 years, that won't be who you are, because that body will be gone. So, or 200 years, who knows how long we're going to live, but you know, it could be a while. But so those realities we have to get deeper to tune into. But how do we know anything? Intuitively. It has to resonate. There has to be a certain germ of truth in it that we can say, I understand that. And Jesus tried to keep things very practical. You know, I was referring to the blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, you don't see God with these eyes unless you've got a clean heart that you can relate to a deeper reality. So he tried to keep things on a very practical level. But yeah, the interpretation also depends on who's interpreting.
Yeah.
Who is the person?
Correct.
One person may not be able to understand subtler aspects of it.
Yeah.
In the East, you come to realize that we don't live in an either-or universe. We live in a universe that has a wide spectrum of reality, just like the radio spectrum, the spectrum of light and radio waves, and how it's all connected. And we find our own position on that gradually over time. But you can't just take a kindergartner and start teaching them calculus unless they're
Yeah,
a very
exactly.
unusual kindergartner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's a bit what we were talking about with Constantine, that it was his view and the way he saw things that made him include certain gospels and not others. Now, Jesus lived in a particularly hard time for this type of spirituality, for this type of knowledge, and this is partially why he was so resisted. How do you see that? Why was that time difficult for him?
That time was, well, and this is something, this is another point that Yogananda brought to the West. His own teacher, Swami Sri Yukteswar, wrote an entire book and described a science of how the world, the earth, moves through different ages, through different eras or epochs. He called them yugas. And there are several wonderful books out now about this cycle of time, the cycles of time. But the era that Jesus lived in was a very dark age. The Greeks had their tradition of a gold age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age, for example. And many traditions had these four different ages. So if Jesus was in the darkest age, people's understandings were very limited. They could relate to this body, these walls, these buildings, this form. So he couldn't speak of things that were subtler, things that were energy-based, energetic realities, because people didn't tune into those things at that time. It was a little beyond the scope of their understanding. If we think now, how would I explain my cell phone or the internet connection that I have, or the fact that I can talk video conference with somebody on the other side of the planet by looking into this little box? Whoa, you take that back hundreds of years, very difficult.
But even today, to understand about electricity as a form of energy is pretty normal. To talk about energy healing is woo-woo, is weird.
Definitely. Yeah.
Still today.
Yes.
In fact, in India, we were working on a technology for solar, to create solar energy and to harness it and store it. I remember asking the engineer, who was a Yale graduate and one of our monks, one of our spiritual people over there in India, define electricity for me. Tell me, what is electricity? Well, you can get around it in different ways, but it's really hard to get at what is that thing. It's very, it's challenging. So that Jesus couldn't explain energy as prana moving through your body the way yoga does. And even now, even 100, 200 years ago, it was limited what you could say about those things.
So how do we know the truth about what Jesus taught?
Intuitively. There's no way around it. No one is going to tell us the absolute truth. It has to be experienced inside. There's too many things that have happened. Constantine taking out those gospel passages and so many things subject to interpretation, translation. It's impossible. There's so much information. The only way we'll ever understand is through meditation, through really inner communion with Christ.
And through attunement, through really striving. The game is loaded a little bit. In the Eastern tradition, the tradition is when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yes.
When the disciple is ready, the guru appears, or the spiritual teacher appears. I will confess, as a quick aside, that frustrated me significantly, because I felt that I was jolly well ready, and where was my teacher, guru, whatever? It took a little time, but these things have to unfold in their own way. That sort of thing used to bother me a lot. As an American, it bothered me a lot. I really wanted to get to, well, what is it? Either it is or it isn't. Just say what it is. Well, then you come to realize that there are many levels to these things. It's not just a simple, this is the absolute interpretation of that saying. How can a Christian today interpret, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light? What are you going to make of that? That's a very challenging saying. Well, So what the translators, what they say is, if your eyes are good, then your whole body will be well, or some sort of vague mush like that. Well, that doesn't give you a deep truth, but he was putting in little markers for people, breadcrumbs for people to follow afterwards. But they had to have the eyes to see, the ears to hear. He would say that sort of thing too.
Yeah.
So I mean, he would give you options and ways to tune in, but it was clearly people who wanted to do so and who were ready to do so. He wouldn't just give those things to anybody.
Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that Christ, the man, was an Oriental. He wasn't a Westerner. In the West, we have black or white. Everything is logical and linear.
Yeah.
But in the East, things are a spectrum, as Dharmadas was saying. There's all kinds of interpretations.
Yeah. Swami Satchidananda's phrase, truth is one, paths are many, keeps coming to my mind. And so if this is the situation, if this, we seem to be convinced that things are as we are discussing them, and what would be the benefit for Christians to understand the yogic nature of Jesus?
I think they would experience a much deeper reality of his teachings, of his tradition. I think ultimately they would experience the truth of his nature. They would actually experience his being. To me, that's the most important thing. Socially, there would be all sorts of implications, as Nirmala was mentioning. But the service element, those things have been prominent in the West. I mean, charitable work, there's all sorts of that kind of thing going on. There's much more that's needed. But the inward realization of the truth that Jesus brought, that would come to people. They would have a deeper experience of that. And that sort of tradition was lost in the West. We had Gnostics, we had Desert Fathers, we had monastic traditions. St. Francis created a lay order that was a monastic tradition in a way, very unusual and kind of unique. But very few traditions actually is there a mentorship. That's pretty well been lost, and particularly in America, there's a real fear of that. There's been abuse, and actually to a degree in India, there's a little bit of fear of that as well, because there's been guru abuse of disciples occasionally, but the tradition itself is still valid. There is a transmission of energy and power and connection, and I think Christians would discover that. I think they would discover that it's not just words on a piece of paper. There is a living spirit and power in those words, but it's easier to get to that when you see it lived and you connect to it personally and on a human level. And that's something that there really isn't so much today in the Christian tradition. And I myself got the chance to sing for the Pope two popes ago, the one who was John Paul II, who was Pope for quite a few years. And afterwards he came and greeted us. We were in front of a huge audience, 13,000 people, but I remember shaking his hand, and I felt something. And I was surprised, because I had no expectation of anything particularly. And that there is a kind of magnetic transmission that happens on a human level. It's harder to get it just simply through a book. It's not impossible. There is a vibration that comes through there.
Yeah.
But it is subject to interpretation and misinterpretation. So, it's easier to get it when someone is actually conveying it to you, and the truth of their life that they live sort of resonates, kind of gives you the sense of that. It's not just an abstraction.
Yeah, it's an embodied knowledge and embodied wisdom.
Well, think about trying to learn a computer just from the manual. It's impossible.
Yeah.
You have to have
exactly.
someone
Yes.
show you.
Yes.
Or you have to have an 8-year-old.
Absolutely. Now, on the other hand, it's true that we defined the knowledge of the computers as intuitive. Mm?
Macs are.
But all of them are coming to be more intuitive.
More and more.
Yes.
And it's sort of, we're in an ascending age. We're in an age of energy. We're in an age where people expect things to work. They expect connectedness. They expect the sense that we're all one, that we're
Yeah.
all part of each other's reality. Those things are becoming sort of more obvious to the collective awareness.
Yeah.
Not automatic, but
And perhaps not as fast as
Yeah.
some of us would
yeah,
like to,
yeah,
Yes.
but it's happening.
It is
It
happening.
is happening.
It's happening, and after all, yoga has been around for 6,000 years, so we shall trust that it will continue. There's a number of tales in yoga, stories, little pieces of you know, popular knowledge expressed that way. Do you have one that you like that could shine some light on Jesus' yogic nature?
Well, the story I would tell isn't so much of a personal story, but it's I alluded to it a little bit earlier, which these I remember being struck by in the Bible the story of these wise men coming and finding this child in an unmarked house, and there they came, and gave him gifts and honored him. And lots of questions come up. Were they only wise because they were able to find him, because they had the vision, the insight? I mean, the typical traditions where they looked at the stars and they saw this and that and the other thing written in the heavens. Okay, fine. There's got to be a lot of inspiration and a lot of commitment
And devotion.
devotion
Devotion.
to get on a camel or a horse or
Yeah.
a whatever and travel
Yeah.
hundreds or thousands of miles across the world to
Yeah.
find this soul, and then to successfully do it and return and so forth. The story, the tradition is that Jesus himself repaid that visit. And this is another one of these awkward aspects of the biblical tradition, because in the Bible, he gets to be the age of 13 or 14, and there's some bland comment about he grew in wisdom and God's favor, and then he shows up at
Voila.
the age of 30, and he's expressing his mission and he's teaching the multitudes. Well, what happens in between there? There's
Exactly.
16, 18 years in there where we don't know what happened. The tradition is that he went to India,
Yeah.
that he received training, that he learned these things from Indian sages, that he repaid the visit of these wise men who came. Can we prove it? Well, there are records.
There are records. There's also a very ardent oral tradition in Asia and in India about a saint from Israel, right in that time period, Saint Issa, I-S-S-A. And there's records in the Tibetan monastery Himas that I think it was Nicholas Notovich came across those records in 1894. And then in the 20s, Nicholas Roerich also went there and found those same records. So there's a vibrant history there, but it's not something that many churches in the West want to hear.
It's an inconvenient.
Like your
Yes.
questions when you were
Yes,
Yes.
quite. It's an inconvenient because it raises the question, well, why did the Son of God need any training? Did he, in fact, need training? And that's an awkward question.
Yeah.
But he was human and divine both. And there's the human dimension to these things.
Exactly.
And the fact that India has had these traditions in an unbroken line since, as you were mentioning at the beginning of the program, 6,000 years. Well, that's 6,000 years that we know. That's not beyond 6,000 years. I mean, it could easily go back further than that. It's just that that's the point at which we know it's been going on for 6,000 years. And so those things have been very strong and very powerful over there all of these years.
Yeah.
We ourselves visited one of the places that Jesus was said to have gone, which in addition to that Tibetan monastery, he is said to have gone to Puri, which is the Jagannath temple on the east coast of India, down right on the ocean. And there's a powerful tradition there, and there are records in that place as well. Now, again, these things are inconvenient. Most Christians are not interested in such things, and therefore people tend to see the world that they look at is sort of the world they expect to see.
Yeah.
And so if it's not part of that world, it's like it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
I am certain that we could continue for hours because so many more questions are coming to my mind, and it's really interesting. But I am aware that as when I introduce you, you are musicians. So I would like to know if you would gift us with a song. If you could do that.
Happy
Happily.
to do that.
Then let's get ourselves set for that.
thank you.
Good people, let me come with you. Perhaps he's just around this bend. But whether near or far, I too have been looking for a friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your points of view, and your beautiful music with us. I look forward to having you again in the show. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
My guests today are Dharmadas and Nirmala. They are spiritual directors of an Ananda Sacramento, a yoga community and teaching center in the Rancho Cordova area of Sacramento. They bring the experience of nearly 40 years of meditation, yoga, spiritual living, and practice to their teaching in North America, Europe, Asia, and India. Both raised as Christians, they've studied, taught, and worked with the teachings of Jesus from a mystical and yogic standpoint. In addition, they are both musicians who find joy in sharing spiritual teachings and inspiration through music. The center in Sacramento is part of Ananda, a global movement founded in 1968 by Swami Kriyananda, based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. I hope you liked our show today. And if you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com. I look forward to seeing you the next time.